Well, we're delighted to have our afternoon panel on, as I mentioned earlier, Syria, ISIS, and the plight of Mideast Christians. Our speakers, again, as I mentioned earlier, but as a reminder, is a very distinguished set, as you would expect. David Shedd, who was former acting director of the Defense Intelligence Agency as part of a long career in intelligence and national security, and now teaching at Patrick Henry College, among other projects. And of course, to his right, Faith McDonnell, who's been with the IRD for 22 years now, one of the foremost experts on the plight of persecuted Christians everywhere. And to her right, to her left, I'm getting my directions mixed up, is Paul Marshall, who is with the Hudson Institute and one of the great scholars on religious freedom, and also a member of the board of directors of the IRD for many years. And then finally, our partner and moderator and contributor, Robert Nicholson of the Philos Project, who will be offering his own proposals for some approximation of justice and protection for Mideast minorities. So everybody, we're delighted that you're here. And Robert, if you could get us started.
Thank you, Mark. Am I mic'd? I guess I'm speaking into this. So this Syria, ISIS, Christians, and the American approach. That's the topic of this panel, and I'm so happy that we have the panelists that we have. I think it's the perfect group to address the question. So this is going to be a little bit different than the first panel. Because the Middle East is a messy place, I thought it'd be better to have sort of a messy panel. And I'll just sort of, what I want to do is kind of raise some issues, talk just a little bit about the article that I wrote, or the comment that I wrote in this first issue, and then just sort of tee some things up for these guys to address. I know we're going to hear some history, some sort of Western Church, Eastern Church, all kinds of different things, and also a geopolitical perspective. But I think what Bill Kristol actually said there just toward the end of his remarks was this idea of not getting distracted by presentism, I think is actually a really key point. Both in journalism, but also in approaching world affairs at large. And I think it's easy to sort of weigh into these issues as if they exist on separate planets, and to think about our time as being sort of distinct from 10 years ago or 10 years from now. And I think it's important to sort of think about it in a really big way. And I think for me, you look at this moment in the Middle East, in the opening paragraph of my piece, which is called Towards a New Middle East Policy, I try to lay out sort of where we're at or what's going on today, but I'm trying to put it in a larger context of, what is happening in this region in the long term. And I think to really get a sense for where we're at today, I mean, you could go all the way back, and I think Paul Marshall is going to take us pretty far back, but I think you at least need to go back 100 years ago and see what happened in the aftermath of World War I. I think it's interesting, the 100 years ago theme that comes up on all of these issues related to sort of isolationism versus interventionism. We talked about them already today. But in the context of the Middle East, what happened at the end of World War II was sort of a collapse of the then existing order. And the Allies won, the Ottomans lost, and different parts of that empire were parceled out, and they sort of worked, at least for a time. But in the heartland, in the sort of Semitic heartland, you had this arrangement that was enforced by the Allies and by the League of Nations, and that was essentially what is often called the Sykes-Picot arrangement. The centennial, actually, for that arrangement will be next year. Today we stand 100 years later in sort of what appears to be a collapse, or certainly a muddling of those lines and those states, a questioning of whether there's actually any sort of essential truth to these states, if that makes any sense. And I think much of what we see in the turmoil, I mean, really going back to the beginning of this millennium, but also, especially in the last few years with the Arab Spring and everything that happened afterward, much of it is still part of this same question, in which the residents of the region are asking themselves, what is the sort of material element with which we are going to build a new society? In the beginning, after World War I, it was sort of, maybe it's secular Arab nationalism. And that sort of worked for a while, sort of. There was many people who wanted communism, many Arabs and sort of the elite classes. Sort of the middle of the century to the end of the century, you've seen this this search for cultural authenticity in Islam. And we're seeing that being played out in an ever more escalated fashion today. And, you know, we in the West want to see democracy and freedom of thought and self-determination. But it seems, you know, the population seems very resistant to what we think would be a good idea. So for me, I think it's important to sort of zoom out and to think about this, what I think is not only a civilizational crisis that a lot of people talk about between sort of East and West, or Islam and the Western world, and that's a whole discussion in and of itself, but also sort of an internal civilizational crisis within the Middle East, within Semitic or Arab culture. And I think what I'd like to do, just to sort of speak broadly, and we're going to dive down into the issues, but just to raise just a few questions here at the outset. I'm just going to sit down and let everybody present. I think, you know, for me, if we're speaking, you know, if Providence is speaking to the American public or to American leaders, there's some things that we have to answer. And that is, you know, the first one is sort of, what is America's interest in this place, really? What should America want? Like, what do we actually want to see there? Or are we just sort of reacting to react? By the same token, it's a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, so what should Christians want? And is it the same thing that Americans should want? And is there some sort of distinction between what the church should be advocating for and what the state should be doing? Another important thing is, I think, whatever your political position, I think it's important to reflect on the last 15 years of our very intense engagement with the region and think about, not even in sort of a critical way necessarily, but really sort of reflect upon what are the lessons that we've learned about what works and what doesn't, and what people want and what they don't want. I think for American Christians in weighing into these debates, I think it's important to ask, how should we respond? How should we prioritize? And I think more importantly too, how do we articulate what we want? Much of what we want is sort of rooted in our sort of morality. And as Bill alluded to, and I think many people recognize, it's difficult to make sort of moral arguments, much less Christian arguments, in the public square. And questions about, you know, issues. You know, what about our self-interest? What about religious freedom, which we're going to hear a lot about? What about self-determination for the peoples there? What about our allies? I think it's no secret that our allies, both Israel and the Saudis, and you can list, you know, a fairly sizable list in the region, feel pretty alone right now and are looking for other benefactors. And that's really disturbing for many reasons, not least of all because of Russia's growing involvement. I think there's a larger question of sort of religion and foreign policy that underlies this whole project, particularly when you're talking about Christianity and foreign policy, and much of what we're facing is another religion, and that is Islam. What is that about, and how do we work through that? In my article, and I'll just say a few words about it, what I try to do is sort of get away from the specific issue of the issues and think about it more in a structural context, meaning how is the Middle East set up? How has it been set up? How might it be set up? Or what are the different ways that we can think about approaching it? And really what it comes down to is realizing that the Middle East is not just all of these nice color-coded countries, but there's distinct sort of peoples and organic communities that live there that see themselves as part of a community and only secondarily as part of this sort of supranational state. And, you know, does that mean sort of redrawing all the lines to put them all in their own little boxes? Not necessarily, but I think as Americans, and this is very conceptual, but I think it's an idea that we need to work into our foreign policy a little bit more, because I would argue that it actually would increase stability and actually make the people there probably a little bit more happy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit down and I'm going to let these other panelists speak, and then we're going to have hopefully sort of a rowdy discussion and come to some conclusions at the end. So thank you very much.
Okay, can go back one. Several people have already alluded to Nigel Bigger's excellent article in the first issue of Providence. And one of the things he says there is describing the tendency of moral theologians to be pontificating on abstractions. He says, one remedy for this ailment is for Christian ethicists to read less moral theology and political philosophy and study more history. It's not saying you just do one rather than the other, but that we often lack history. And Americans, amongst the world's peoples, tend to be ones often less interested in history. Ambrose Bierce, in his Devil's Dictionary, the definition he gives of war in the Devil's Dictionary is, war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. A quip with too much truth to be entirely funny. But that's also a tendency with history. So I simply want to give some long history in the context of the Middle East, and particularly in understanding ISIS as it understands itself. So what I'm going to do in my sort of allotted 15 minutes, so a lot of what I'm going to do is give a history of Christian-Muslim relations, or relations between Christendom and Islamdom over the last 1,300 years. This means that I will generalize. I will probably lack a certain nuance and subtlety, will not add all the necessary qualifications which certainly need to be added, but I want to give an idea of the sweep. So let me just say at the outset, I'll be concentrating on conflict, but the history, relations between Christians and Muslims is not always conflict. Throughout all the period we were talking about, we were all trading with each other, forming alliances. Christians would form alliances with Muslims to fight other Christians. For a long time in the Ottoman Empire, the British and other Western powers were far more worried about the Russians. So they're trying to keep the Ottoman Empire solid as a bulwark against the Russians. So there's all sorts of cooperation and other things going on here. But I want to look at some of the long pattern of conflict. Look at the TV screens, if you can see them. There are three shades of purple there. The very dark shade on the western part of the Arabian Peninsula is the areas believed to have been controlled by Muhammad and his immediate followers at the time of his death in 632. The medium shade is expansion up to 1661, 29 years later. You'll notice at this point there are Arab armies on the Atlantic. If you take the lighter shade, this is expansion up to 750. So here you get, and for a time, as many of you will know, those armies also got into southern France, as far as Poitiers in the Loire Valley. So they're about 150 miles south of Paris. On the eastern side, on the edge there, had moved into India down the Indus Valley, and were also in the western parts of what is now China. So in the space of 100 years, you have armies from central France to China, and you control that territory in between them. One could say many things about this. I just want to say, whatever else it is a spectacular achievement. It's an imperial one, but that would not be unusual. If the Byzantine Empire in the middle of it could have done that, it would have. It wasn't that everybody else around was being nice and not invading people. Everybody was doing that. It was just that this was spectacularly successful. If we move on, this is harder to see, and I'm afraid the laser pointer I don't think works on TV screens. At least doesn't work on 5 of them at the same time. So, but you can vaguely see a line going through the Mediterranean, down through the southern part of the Sahara Desert, right down the east coast of Africa to what is now, in modern terms, Mozambique, Madagascar, and through the Indus Valley. This is in the year 1100. So continuing that expansion. Let us move ahead to the year 1500. And in Spain, now with the Reconquista, at this point, Muslims, or at least Muslim rulers have been driven out of Spain, have expanded further into Africa, right down now through the Indus Valley, again into southwestern China, taken over Malaysia, what is now Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So you have this almost continual expansion. You might notice I didn't mention the Crusades because they were not important. Nobody talked about the Crusades very much until the 19th century. They were, to quote Bernard Lewis, a short-lived, failed, attempted counterattack by the Christian powers. And, Christians lost the Crusades. So it was not a very big grievance for the Arabs at the time. They won. What's to complain about? So you get this pattern of expansion, and you will also note, if you're closer to the TV than I am, at this point, the expansion goes into Europe as far as Vienna twice, 1525. Rome was parts of Rome were burned in 846. Raids went as far as Iceland. Ottoman armies moving north through what is now Russia, taking Moscow. Most of European Russia was under the control of Muslims for 2 centuries. And we in the West tend to forget all of these. But what you have at this point is a picture like this goes to about 1600, 1700. The first 1,000 years of Muslim history was almost a continuing pattern of success. They bestrode the world. Is that the other one? Areas at one time under Muslim rule. They're not one country, but they're the dominant force. What else is there? Europe is poor and barbaric. They control India. China is powerful, but stays within its borders. It's at the fulcrum of the 3 major continents at this point. It's richer, it's more powerful, it's cultured, it's literate than anywhere else. So there's this expectation of success that, to use sort of Christian terms, profane history and sacred history are one. Islam is not only the truth, but it's the winning truth. So you're accustomed to this for 1,000 years. Then it changes. It doesn't change quickly. It just means you start losing more battles than you used to. And then you start losing most of your battles, and the tide changes. This happens over a period of centuries, but if you wanted to pick one date as sort of to memorize this fulcrum, it's September the 11th, 1683. This would probably be the high water mark of Islamic military expansion. At this point, the Ottomans are encamped for the second time outside Vienna. On September the 12th, they lose badly. They'd lost wars before. But then we kept on losing. We're driven out of Austria, driven out of Hungary, driven out of Serbia, driven out of Romania, Bulgaria, Greece. Also at this time, the Russians also pushing the Tatars and others out of Russia and expanding to the east. So at this point now, the Christian powers are reasserting control over Christian majority areas. And you could say, well, that's maybe to be expected. But then it continues. Let's go back to that map of 1500 and the process which we now often call colonialism. When European powers sail around Africa and Columbus sails west, the main thing they're trying to do, of course, is get around that big red blob. To be able to trade with the places with the East, sort of getting around Islam. And then we began projecting Europeanness on us at the moment, or Christianness, to take over these places. So the French and the British take over chunks of West Africa. Who do they take it over from? Muslims. Take over the east coast of Africa. Who would you take it over from? Muslims. The British take over India. Who do they take it over from? It's majority Hindu, but the rulers of most of India were Muslims. Similarly for Malaysia, the Dutch take over Indonesia. So what happens is that around the world, you're getting the displacement of Muslim power by, using some religious terms here, Christian power. And that's how many Muslims would describe it these days. But so these external areas around the world are also taken over. So Europeans sort of reclaim Europe, then they start taking chunks of Africa and Asia, and they don't stop, and then start moving into the Islamic heartland. This is a map of the Ottoman Empire. The lighter browny color is the extent of the Ottoman Empire in 1683, reaching to Vienna. And the darker brown is the Ottoman Empire as of 1914, the beginning of the First World War. So it has shrunk. European powers are now controlling what is, now Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Britain. I mean, Napoleon invades Egypt in 1798. The British defeat him and take over and then hang around for 150 years. So what you're getting is Middle Eastern countries, the Muslim heartland, now begins to get taken over. And so probably the most significant decade was mentioned earlier, the 1920s. After the First World War, the Ottoman Empire collapses. The European powers now divide up the Middle East. And there's almost no areas which Muslims themselves control. Areas you could look at are Afghanistan, but that's pretty remote. Turkey and Iran maybe, but they're very secular. Ataturk forcibly secularizes Turkey and abolishes the caliphate on March 3rd, 1924. So Turkey, if for modern Muslim radicals, Turkey and Iran in that period would be apostate regimes. And that basically just leaves Saudi Arabia as somewhere that Muslims control. And this lasted for a while until 1990. And this morning you will have heard what happened in 1990. Well, Keith Pavlicek left Missouri and went to Saudi Arabia. That is, American and other troops went to Saudi Arabia to help defend Saudi Arabia against Saddam Hussein, who had just previously invaded Kuwait. This is the only area where sort of Christian armies only substantial area where Christian armies had not yet been. And as I think many of you will know, this is the thing that for bin Laden and Al-Qaeda was the #1 issue. Infidels walk on the land where Muhammad was born and where the Quran was revealed. This is the latest and greatest aggression. So that is the image which is seen. So you have 1,000 years of stunning success, followed by 300 years of crippling failure on every league table in the world, measures of democracy, measures of wealth, unless you have oil, measures of human rights. You're at the bottom of everything. And why? And also, if you're looking at a map like this, you're going from, let's see if I can, we'll go back. You're going from this to this. So, what went wrong? To paraphrase Bernard Lewis, or to quote Bernard Lewis, what went wrong? Why are we failures for 300 years? There's many attempted answers, and this question is fermented in the Muslim world continually. But one answer given by radicals, and not only by them, is we stopped being good Muslims. When we were good Muslims, we were successful. Look what happened. But now we've been chasing after the West. We've been looking to false gods. We've been looking to democracy, to science, to education, to any of these things. We need to stop that. We need to return to a pure form of Islam as they believe existed in the first generations. So if we can do that again, then we will once more be successful. So, I'll go back to have a look at that map again, areas under Muslim rule, and compared with this. This is from Hizbut Tahrir, what it wants as the restoration of the caliphate. Those maps are almost identical, and we can see. So, and then ISIS has been putting out similar maps. So from their perspective, we have invaded the Muslim world and tore it apart. That process has been going on for 300 years. A low point probably the 1920s, and now they want to reverse that process. If we want to understand, we need to understand much more than this, obviously. But if we want to understand them and the attraction for many people, we have to remember that this is how history is seen by many of the people in the Middle East or by many Muslims in other places. And that is what they're taught. And if one accepted the history simply as told in this way, you would be aggrieved too. So as we look in more detail and concrete terms in the Middle East, we need to realize that there's 1,300-year patterns here of which we are usually ignorant, but are very much in the minds and hearts of people, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's good to be here with everyone today. I am going to bring us forward to not only modern times, but postmodern times, to discuss the failure of the West and the church in particular to help Christians in the Middle East today. But before I do, I just want to go back even further than Paul went, just for a minute, and probably anybody who's been around Congressman Frank Wolf will already know this because he's been talking about it for years now. But the history of Christianity in Iraq and Syria that goes back just so far and means so much. Christianity in the Bible, Abraham was from Iraq. Rachel was from Iraq. One of the things that I found out too as I was going through that kind of study was not only this, but when we come to the day of Pentecost, there were God-fearing Jews outside listening to the people up there speaking in all kinds of languages, hearing their own languages. They were hearing languages from Iraq and Syria too. These were believing Jews in Iraq and Syria who then, some of whom may have listened to Peter's sermon and become Christians then. So we come from a family as Christians, a body of Christ. We call ourselves the family of God, brothers and sisters, but we have failed the Christians in Iraq and Syria miserably, just as we have failed many other persecuted Christians. So like I said, I want to come into the postmodern times to talk about a little bit about that. My first article for Providence isn't finished yet, so I can't quote it to you, but these are some of the ideas that I am working on. And the two connected thoughts that I see in this are the fact that we have two incomplete or faulty worldviews going on, as well as two false narratives about the issue going on. And these are all connected, but let me start. The first faulty, I'd say, worldview is the totally secular worldview, the worldview that depends on secularism. And this has been detrimental to the Christians, not only in Iraq and Syria, but to persecuted Christians around the world, because secularism says, get over it. Believing in God isn't that big a deal. Just pretend you don't or something, and you won't get killed. So there isn't a seriousness about dealing with Christians and other believers in other religions, minority religions, who are being persecuted, particularly right now in Iraq and Syria by radical Islam. That worldview is the worldview that you would think would start to understand now, especially after what Paul was talking about with the challenge that has come to us that we're going to build the caliphate again. But because of this secular mindset, they don't even take that seriously. Secularists say, that's just rhetoric. This is something in 22 years working for Christians who are being persecuted, I've heard many times whenever the president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, would make a statement about jihad against the Christians in the South, the State Department would say, well, that's just rhetoric. We see the results of that rhetoric over and over again in the forms of genocides, as one of the panelists was saying this morning, but there's been genocide in Sudan and now genocide of the Christians in the Middle East going on because the secularist point of view doesn't take this. Now I'm going to get a little bit more pushy and say that there's also a faulty worldview in Christianity, and I'm not going to get into that as much, but to say that it's almost a form of secularism as well, because it's focused on us. You could say maybe it's an isolationist Christian worldview, that Christians in the West have their own comforts that they don't want to be disrupted. So there's more focus on the issues that affect us in the West, the domestic issues, particularly today with the attacks on the Christian church in America, that people think, oh, you know, my plate's full. I can't really deal with these other issues. But according to the Bible, that is a faulty worldview. That's sin, actually, if you want to know the truth, because we are told over and over in the Bible that we have a responsibility as Christians to our brothers and sisters, and we are told to bear one another's burdens. We're told to, if one part of the body suffers, the rest of the body suffers. So we need to take that seriously as Christians and get over that faulty worldview and see the worldview as the body of Christ around the world. Then secondly, there are two false narratives that I want to discuss. And the first false narrative has to do more, again, with the world. And that is that, well, we have to be careful when we're talking about the Middle East that it doesn't look like we're favoring Christians. So this is why, for instance, when a friend of mine, Bishop Julian Dobbs, went to the State Department to see about helping to get Christian refugees from Iraq into the United States, he was told, and let me make sure I get the quote right from the Office of Population, Refugees, and Migration, there is no way that Christians will be supported because of their religious affiliation. That's what the State Department told the bishop, who brought with him a lord from Sir Charles Hoare, the 9th Baronet of Annabella, County Cork, who had offered to pay for the transportation of these Christians who were in such dire straits that even in an area where usually the religious leaders say, you know, oh, we don't want them to leave because otherwise Christianity won't be in the Middle East anymore. But these people were in such a bad condition that even the bishops were saying, yes, please, if you can get some of them out, help us. And they were going to have their way paid. They were going to have payment for being settled in the United States. All that the State Department had to do was to allow them to come in as refugees. But they told Bishop Dobbs, there is no way that Christians will be supported because of their religious affiliation. Now, you know, being charitable, I'll say that the false narrative there is that they're just afraid that that they'll think they're favoring Christians. You know, I mean, you could say it might have to do with hostility towards Christians, but we won't get into that. What one false narrative could be is that the State Department and others in the government just don't want to be seen as favoring Christians because then that will cause more problems in the Middle East. But that is a false narrative because they're not being favored, they're really being disfavored. And I'll give you a few statistics. Well, first of all, a quote from Kirsten Powers speaking about the murder of 12 Christian migrants that were thrown into the sea. This was back in April, for praying to Jesus instead of Allah. Kirsten Powers stated that President Barack Obama just can't seem to find any passion for the mass persecution of Middle Eastern Christians or the eradication of Christianity from its birthplace. And he didn't refer to them as Christians. So there is that. But then in terms of the statistics on people being let into the United States, we just have a really Sorry. Okay, here it is. The State Department, while admitting 4,425 Somalis to the United States in just the first 6 months of fiscal year 2015, and possibly even accepting members of ISIS through the Syrian and Iraqi refugee programs, all paid for by our tax dollars, wouldn't support a special category to bring Assyrian Christians into the United States. And that's before this latest push to bring in more refugees and more migrants. So that's the one false narrative. And we really need, as Christians, to counter that narrative, to show the truth about what's going on, about the fact that the numbers of Christians being let in are so minuscule compared to everything else, while the situation of Christians is so desperate, more desperate than someone who comes in just for financial reasons or for what has been called immigration jihad. But this is something that we really need to address as Christians. It's part of our responsibility. And then my last point is the other false narrative, the false narrative that is in the church itself. And this became clear to me when I saw a video online that was produced by a young Christian filmmaker, and God bless him for doing it, but it was a love letter to ISIS. Does anybody remember that? Talking about with beautiful scenery and the words across the screen saying, you know, we love Jesus and we believe in forgiveness, and we invite you to find Jesus. Well, that's great as it stands, but I looked to see Catherine Lopez asked this gentleman, are you going to now do a video about the situation of the Christians themselves under ISIS? And he said no, he was on to other things. So to me, that's the problem. You're portraying something which is true, that we as Christians we're told to forgive, but we can't forget our brothers and sisters. So there's a false narrative in the church that says and again, forgive my lack of charity, but we who are so morally superior and self-righteous, we can forgive the persecution of our brothers and sisters, and we can love ISIS and embrace them. And it's not them that's being persecuted, so I don't know really how morally superior that is. But there's an idea in the church that we can't just advocate for Christians, we have to advocate for everyone. And that's true, but sometimes when that happens, the Christians are the ones who get left behind. And the Bible says clearly, do good to all men, but particularly to those who are of the household of faith. And the household of faith are the Christians in Iraq and Syria. So I urge you, and I will be writing in Providence magazine about doing good to the household of faith. Thank you.
When Mark asked me to talk about the geopolitical framework or scenario of Syria, I was thinking back to July of 2013, and I was at the Aspen Security Forum, and you can find me on the front page of the New York Times having been quoted on two things that I said would occur in Syria in the absence of, and I'll get to filling in that blank. I was asked the question, is U.S. policy and more broadly the West responding in an adequate way from that March 2011 to July 2013, so about 2 years after the Arab Spring, clearly turning fully into fall foliage, maybe even the start of winter in Syria. And I said, here are two affirmative views that I have informed by my knowledge and intelligence that I look at and, yes, approved by the Defense Department to use. Point number one was that in the full scope of that opposition in Syria, the extremist elements, ISIS or ISIL or Daesh, did not exist yet per se, but Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is really the foundation for it, former Baathists and so forth from Iraq as well included in that, broke away from the al-Nusra front. That end of the spectrum will get stronger over time in the absence of external intervention in Syria. Secondly, my prediction was, which I thought was as obvious as the nose on my face, and already our panelists have talked about it, particularly Paul in terms of the maps that he put up, is that they will not accept the borders as we know them in that region, in the Levant, and then beyond. But I was speaking about the Levant. In other words, Anbar in Iraq and Western Syria, Eastern Syria, all of it becomes the same into Lebanon, Jordan, and beyond. I was summarily called on the carpet for my comments, when in fact I thought I was saying something that was painfully obvious. I don't say this to gloat because I was somehow predictive or prophetic in what we would see in the region, as time has shown, but rather, this is the tagline for today in my brief remarks to you. What you believe is inextricably linked to how you behave. What you believe is inextricably linked to how you behave. So what we have seen here is the manifestation of evil, and I knew that in that full spectrum of 100, 110,000 in the opposition, the proclaimed opposition inside Syria in the summer of 2013, that far extremist, Islamist extremist end of it were prepared to die for their cause. The ones seeking water rights and other grievances were not nearly as prepared to fight for their cause to the death. In other words, we faced an opposition that knows what they believe in and are prepared to be martyred for it. Martyred, killed, whatever form you want to say it. Secondly, those borders of 100 years ago, drawn between the French and the British, do you ever wonder why they're straight lines? They literally pulled out the ruler and drew straight lines. So it's insignificant. I think even more profoundly, the Westphalian borders of the world are actually being extremely challenged. And that reflection of that summer of 2013 is today now the manifestation of where we're headed in terms of ISIL. As the old adage goes, pay me now or pay me a whole lot later. And that is exactly the situation that we're in today. Why is it they're able to recruit on the ISIL-Daesh side with such vibrancy and such success in social media, and then do their crowdsource attacks and call for attacks and crowdsourcing? It's because they actually are very clear in what they believe in. And as you look at Western civilization, they are able to juxtapose what they believe in with an eternal value associated with it, absolutely an eternal value. We fundamentally disagree with how they get to that eternity or that eternal value, but nonetheless are prepared to die for it. And I do not think that by and large the West is anywhere close to being able to fight that infinite war that they're involved in with finite tools that we have at our disposal. Bombs alone won't kill them. In other words, there is an ideological bankruptcy on our side, writ large, not in this room, of course, not in this room, but writ large in Western society. Empty churches throughout Europe is a reflection of that. The apostasy inside the United States on the belief system and what you're prepared to die for. I grew up on the mission field as a missionary kid, born in Bolivia, raised in Latin America, Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. And I know that when we are looked at, and I do a lot of work in Latin America, having just returned last night from Mexico City, they're wondering, what do we believe in the United States? Is it Hollywood? Is it, what is it that we actually believe in? And more importantly, what are we prepared to die for? Thank you very much.
So, okay. There's so many things that I think we can talk about, and we're going to get to questions here shortly, but because each of the panelists raised what I think is sort of an essential element of this whole discussion, and that is faith or worldview and religion, I think that's something that we should maybe start off with right here at the beginning. And Paul, you know, I think one of the points that you made is a strong one. That is, you know, we really don't see things as they see them, and it's important that we do. And I think it was really interesting that cover story in the Atlantic on what ISIS really wants and the reception that got, because it really opened a lot of people's eyes about, wow, these people really have a worldview. This isn't driven by sort of economic self-interest. And in faith, you sort of took it from another angle, saying, you know, here are the false narratives and the false worldviews on the Western side of things, both the secular worldviews and the faulty church worldviews. And then David, I think you sort of reiterated Paul's point in saying what you believe is inexorably linked with how you behave. And I think it really, you know, we're sort of, it's like one of those sitcom episodes where, you know, the two characters are talking about this thing and they both think they know what the other one's talking about, and it becomes this really absurd sort of comedy, and then they realize, wait, what are you talking about? What are you? And I think that, I think there's something like that. Of course, the stakes are so much higher, but I think there's something like that happening between the Islamic world and here in the West. So I'd like maybe just for each one of you in the little niche that you've created to sort of elaborate a little bit more, particularly when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. How do we bring an understanding of religion into U.S. foreign policy? It's such an intangible, and it's so diverse, as that article suggested. I mean, how can American diplomats be savvy enough to be dealing with these problems on the ground, and how can we, you know, in the rear, with this journal particularly, be trying to educate them on that?
Well, up to you.
I think we have a conundrum in that when it was the bipolar world with the Soviet Union, it was very clear that there were three pillars of their system versus our three pillars. The first was, remember the old phrase, the godless communists? It was actually, there was religion in all that. And we had a Christian worldview in response to that. Of course, we had capitalism and free market choice versus statism. And then, of course, the political system, the party knew better than the individual. And so you had their view of infinite values in the Soviet Union against ours. I don't think we have defined those in the sense that for the last 7, 8, 10 years, we've been unwilling to actually go into that space about religion and how that plays into this. And I think it speaks to, if not the bankruptcy of our own belief system, certainly it's on life support and the inability to talk in the public square about what we believe in. And before you get to taking that abroad, you better get it home, get it right at home first.
Yeah, I could, and Mark particularly urged me, probably all of Mark Tooley, but probably would apply to any of them, to so bring this back to the journal. One of the sub-themes seeking to do my own presentation is, if you're dealing with Christianity and foreign policy, it's wider than ethics, at least as narrowly defined. It's what motivates human beings. historical question. And there's a tendency amongst many of our policymakers that there are only three things which motivate human beings: money, sex, and power. So religion or faith is not seen as a motivator. It's thought always to be a mask for something else. It's an epiphenomena disguising something else. Now, that's often the case. I mean, we all know people who give very good religious motives when you know what they're really after. But just dismissing the idea that a person's religious beliefs will motivate them. Well, people are going willingly to their deaths and killing themselves. So that's usually not a good way for money, sex, and power. Let's not get into some of the other aspects of that. So what motivates us? And the other one is, in terms of looking at the history, simply taking religion seriously as, as a dynamic. Not all sorts of other things were going on. But as we look at foreign policy, one of the things is just take religion seriously as an important factor of what we're talking about. Now, when we go to ISIS, ISIS is a millenarian cult. I mean, didn't get into the thing, but differently from Al-Qaeda and other groups, it's very much an end times thing, okay? This is Hal Lindsey with tanks. Things are going to end. That's who you're dealing with. And in that context, sort of the usual matters of diplomacy aren't going to get you very far. So unless they all go home for some reason, I think someone mentioned, we often say, there's no military solution for this. In this particular context, I'm tempted to say there's no solution other than a military one to this, at least for these people. In the longer term, there's other things. I work most of the time in Indonesia, and the Indonesians are very interested in seeking to displace the forms of Islam you get in ISIS and amongst the Saudis with their own more open versions. So those are some of the dynamics there, but unless you take religion seriously, you have no idea what's going on with ISIS and with quite a few of the other groups, or why there's a particular animus against religious minorities. So.
And I'll just add a couple of bullet points to that. First of all, I think it was it was 2007 when I met Juliana at a protest in front of the White House about the neglect of the Christians in Iraq. At that point, long before ISIS, long before the Arab Spring and all of that, there just has been, as Paul said, no taking of religion seriously. And when the Constitution for Iraq was created, no big deal, put Sharia in it, that's what they want. That's like their little way of thinking about things. It's not going to make any difference. And so there has been that attitude of not taking religion seriously. And part of that, I think, is what leads to moral equivalence too, that I see in all the work that I do for persecuted Christians around the world, and we're seeing in this situation as well. Our government, the governments of the world, just believe in moral equivalence, and I think it really goes down to they don't believe there's such a thing as evil. It's just it's based on sociological problems and as David said, on water rights and things like that. And we see that in many situations, but it's my hope that Providence will address those things, address the problem of moral equivalence in foreign policy as well.
Okay, I'll have two questions and then we'll open it up. But so, David, I was hoping maybe we should have done this first. It's such a complicated situation right now in Syria with ISIS, with Iran and Hezbollah and Russia and all of these different players. I was wondering if maybe you could just sort of give a sense of like where we're at today and sort of what you see as sort of likely trends over the next year, because ideally Providence will be kind of weighing into the policy side of that debate.
Anyone that opened up the social media today, in whatever form you take it, see that Bashar al-Assad has been able to reopen the resupply into Aleppo. That's the manifestation of the Russian, in particularly the Russian support, and the tide is turning back toward Bashar al-Assad and the Alawite segment of Iraq, of Syria, which represents 10–11% of the population. Syria is, to me, the manifestation of the acme of the Sunni-Shia war that's going on. I believe that Tehran has its proxy wars going on in either active kinetic form or in its covert manners in a number of countries, from Bahrain, the Houthis in Yemen, obviously inside Iraq, with its interests in its version of near abroad in seeking hegemony for the Shia. It is interesting to watch Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah in Lebanon, where they are getting very well practiced in the art of war inside Syria for someday using that capability through the Bekaa Valley and down into Israel. I have no doubt about it. And so those who are counting body bags of Hezbollah coming home, that's just overhead cost of doing business, and while at the same time gaining tremendous opportunities there. It is so interesting that in the history of the region, and certainly, Paul, you would know this much better historically, we just can't get away from Israel being at the center. And so what you have now looking forward in terms of the years ahead, I think you have a very long war. I think you have an unreliable Turkey in the midst of this. You have the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan at severe risk. I think Lebanon could break out in civil war again at any time. I think that civil war could emanate from the refugee camps in Lebanon. It could well emanate from the instability out of Zarqa inside Jordan, which is where Zarqawi, the family, comes from. So there are all the smoke and the kindling underneath in the region plays into this. Isn't it interesting that when Israel went into the Gaza Strip and discovered, or had foreknowledge of, but certainly it publicly was revealed, all the tunnels and all that, the silence was deafening from the Arab world about the Israeli campaign, and I'll call it a campaign, as to going in there vis-a-vis Hamas. Where were the loudest critics? Paris, Berlin, Europe. Anti-Semitic at its core. So I worry a lot about where is Europe in terms of its support for Israel, but nothing will get us out of, I don't care how much we talk about a pivot to Asia, nothing gets us away from that core of that very New Jersey-sized state of Israel when all's said and done. And the Shia and the Sunni will fight over it, and it will surround it, and that noose will get tighter and tighter.
So my last question, we'll open it up. The persecuted Christians, I think, to me, you know, in dealing with different people who talk about the issue, there seems to be sort of a fork in the road when it comes to, you know, people say, okay, I get it, but let's help them. What do we do? So, and you can take a church approach or a state approach, but either way, I think it sort of comes down to this decision between let's get them the heck out of there, they're in mortal danger, and maybe other minorities as well, or allowing for people to leave when needing to leave, but also trying to sort of secure them in some way, some sort of safe haven, a province in Iraq. There's different iterations of this. And people sort of tend to fall on one side or the other, and I'm curious from a geopolitical perspective, from a Christian theological perspective, historical, maybe what views you all have on that, because that, I mean, for people in this room, is a very pressing issue right now.
Well, I tend to fall in the middle. I see the benefits on both sides. And for one thing, I don't think we can speak for other people. If they say, help us get out, I think we have a duty to help them get out. If they want to stay, then we should try to support them there. one of the horrific things that's happening right now, and Nina Shea wrote about, is that Christians who have been in the refugee situation with in northern Iraq with other refugees are being targeted by ISIS, even in refugee camps, and kidnapped or killed. So, you know, if they say that they want to get out, why can they not be part of the 25,000 or however many refugees are going to be coming into the United States? We see that that is a very small minority. So I think that that needs to happen. But mostly it's listening to what they want.
Yeah, I would just agree with that. People are in different, those are complex situations. People are in different situations. We need to find an alternative to the UN system of dealing with refugees, because Christians and Yazidis and other groups are steering clear of those camps. They get attacked, so they don't get screened, they don't get out. In other settings, as in northern Iraq, you're dealing with a refugee population, not under direct threat of being killed at the moment, so is a way of supporting them in that situation. And not much aid is getting to them. So there's a question of, can you also have protected areas? Yeah, and the situation of the Kurds becomes important. And I think we should be much more supportive of them and also critical, because they're doing bad things too. But if we're more supportive, we can be more critical.
David, did you have a view on that? No? Okay, so I'll open it to the audience. Craig?
Yeah, when Bill Clinton was when Bill Clinton was in office, Madeleine Albright said that they've made a mistake about not including the study of religion in international relations, and a lot of the problems that that a number of you talked about basically boil down to a lot of the people in our State Department being completely ignorant of the religion and the history of Islam and how it's related to other religions and countries in the world. And so I was wondering if you had any comments about the state of affairs in education of people in our State Department and in universities in general on the subject of religious education in international relations.
When the International Religious Freedom Act was being created, one of the provisions of that was to help educate the State Department and diplomats in general. At that point, we had found out that the person who was going as ambassador to China had never heard of a house church. So that tells you how ignorant of Christianity in particular, but probably religion in general, a lot of the diplomatic corps was. Unfortunately, none of those provisions have been implemented the way that they should have been. So there's still a great need for that. And there is, this summer, I was speaking on the Middle East at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and our moderator was the religion guy from PBS, and he said to me the day before this happened, before our conference, he said, I just heard something really interesting, that there's like this sign that they put on Christians' houses, and it meant that they were Christians and that they could be killed. This is maybe years, at least months after the noon started appearing on people's houses, and that was the religion editor. So there's an ignorance of religion and of Christianity in particular.
If I could just briefly, I'm not sure of the current deal in the State Department. We should have Tom Farr write an article on that, but it's not just diplomats. As you mentioned, with many journalists, they just don't understand what's happening. My short form of this is said, unless you take religion seriously, you have no idea what's going on in the world. And this is true in terms of understanding Russian conduct. Russians are doing what they did in the 1760s and 1770s in almost exactly the same spot. Sorry.
Leanna?
Yeah, hi, I'm Deborah Weiss, and I have a question. First, I'll just say that I do believe that ISIS is a metastasizing cancer, and that if left unchecked, it will threaten the lives and freedoms of America. But having said that, I would like the panel to address some of the comments that were made here and also on the previous panel regarding the fact that some Christians believe the government should not intervene unless there's self-interest. And my question to you is, how would you address the constitutional issue of acting when there's self-interest? And even though I know we're very powerful, we do still have limits. We do have some limits on budget, on resources, on personnel. So where would you create that boundary? How do you determine, if you're saying that we should help everyone all the time under all circumstances, I can understand that when you're talking about helping your Christian brothers and sisters, but I'm wondering if that squares with constitutional issues.
I would say, you can't help everybody everywhere all the time. Terrible things going on in Myanmar as well. That's usually not on the table. It's more complex, but a reasonable dividing line is the one we're tending to use about genocide. Governments have a responsibility, if they're able to prevent genocide, even if that's not in their particular interest. And in ISIS areas, I think that is what we're seeing. And don't ask me to suggest what military responses would be there. But I would hold it is a moral thing, and it was also a constitutional thing to intervene in that type of situation, even if national interest, as usually defined, is not at stake.
I think there's a net benefit to the expression of faith and the freedom to express that faith when you respond, as Paul said, to genocide. We saw it in Rwanda. Now, it didn't have the drivers that we're seeing in Syria and Iraq and Libya and Egypt and the Sinai and other places, but ultimately it comes down to what are our American values and what are we prepared to openly defend around the globe. And the silence is deafening out of the State Department in a number of areas. I deal a lot with Nepal and the closure of the borders with India, and the suffering people have gone through multiple earthquakes, are not getting fuels and foodstuffs, supplies at the border crossings over having changed their constitution, and there's a complicity by India, and we're silent on it. So it's really about our values.
I would say too, the secular morality you can find in something like R2P, responsibility to protect, which has not worked very well. We really haven't protected any of the people that that program was supposed to protect. And I agree that when it comes to genocide, you've got a whole different set of rules. But also, you said it yourself, Debbie, ISIS is metastasizing. And this is in our own interest as well. And that's probably where it's hardest to get it through some people's heads, that this is a problem to us. This is going to be a threat to our whole way of living. Europe is finding it out really quickly.
Panel, thank you so much for your wisdom. As someone who's dedicated her entire life to the Assyrian cause, and for the last year as a Christian cause since we have come under persecution in our homeland in Iraq and now Syria, I have a few statements and a question for the panel. As we hear my people being airlifted, there is, even though out of the goodness of their hearts, there is a real danger to us as a nation. The Christians of Iraq that we speak of have a nationality, and it is called the Assyrian. Our history is over 6,700 years old. And as people are being airlifted out of Erbil and Aleppo and elsewhere and being dropped into places like Guadalajara and Romania or Poland, these individuals, we historically have thrived in communities. And taking 5 families, place them here and there, that is going to destroy my nation. So that is indirectly contributing in a form of a genocide. I would call it a soft genocide. It's important for everyone present here to understand that aspect, the national aspect of this. The other statement I have is, there is, I believe, as an Eastern Christian who was smuggled into Germany to come to the States as a refugee 25 years ago, I don't think the Western Christians really understand the Eastern Christians. There's that gap that needs to be filled. And I hope this journal, and I hope that Philos Project and partners such as yourselves will help fill that void. Many times when I travel throughout the country, before I'm given the opportunity to present in different churches, they quiz me literally on my Christian theology because I'm an Eastern Christian. Another thing is, you talked about, Paul, you talked about a safe area. We have been let down by the Kurds, not Kurds as people, but the KRG, Kurdish Regional Government, and we have been greatly let down by the Iraqi government. I believe it's extremely important for everyone to understand that we have a Christian military that has been formed in Iraq called the Nineveh Plain Protection Unit. And there is a very real Christian military in Syria that is protecting the 35 villages that have been taken back from ISIS along the banks of Khabar River. So yes, we need protection, but we need to protect ourselves. As Yazidis need to protect themselves, we as Assyrians need to protect ourselves. So I guess the message is, those of you who are interested in talking about protection for the minorities in Iraq, let us empower those military men and women who are dying to protect their own. Now my question is, I have been told several times that we as Assyrians of Iraq and Syria are not important enough to policymakers. We're not important enough to the Western Christians. And I was told not long ago that we are literally dispensable. So my question to you, taking religion out of it, as a real nation that gave civilization to the world, how can we become indispensable in the eyes of the West?
Question.
Thank you.
I'll go first just to say that I don't believe that everybody feels that way. I certainly don't. And shame on those who do. I think if they feel that way, they don't have very much education or intelligence to know, as you said, what marvelous civilization we're talking about. And of course, ISIS is wiping out traces of that civilization all the time. I mean, as horrific as it is to see the videos of beheadings, it sickens your stomach too, to see these beautiful artifacts being destroyed too. So I would say we just need to do a better job of educating people. A lot of it has to do with human nature and selfishness, I think, too. And like I said, a faulty worldview that just sees its own interests. So we've just got to keep pushing. Maybe we just need spiritual revival. That's one big answer.
Just quickly, Christians, religious minorities generally in the Middle East are a bulwark against radicalization. You know, they're not going to join ISIS unless there's a gun to their head. There's often a window to the West. The earliest universities, literature, the novel, and so on. So if the Levant is stripped of its minorities, it will be a far more narrow and destructive place.
Can I just do one last?
Just one last quick comment.
Really quick, on the arming and supporting the troops, I totally believe in that in the Christian militias in Iraq and Syria. I will say what will happen is that people like the US government and the UN will start making moral equivalence between these so-called rebels and those who are the Islamists who are fighting against them, because that's what's happening with the Sudan People's Liberation Army in northern Sudan, who are just fighting to defend people. So you'll get some more of the same, but we'll keep defending you.
Thank you, panel, for your excellent comments. Appreciate it.